trust and on fake news and critical literacy. That young people, and that's that report set out that young people trust the news less as a result of fake news, that only 2% of children have the critical literacy skills they need to identify fake news, and that teachers are concerned about the effect that fake news is having on children's well-being. Links to Newswise resources will be, links to Newswise resources will be shared following the webinar, but for now, I will hand you over to Ellie and Saoirse. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thanks so much, David. Yeah, we're delighted to be here this afternoon and hope you're going to enjoy the session that we've got for you. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see our slides. So hopefully you can now see that on the screen in front of you. We're going to be asking you to take part a little bit. So we'll have a bit of interaction throughout the session today. And we'll just ask you to do that via the chat box. So if you can find the chat box, feel free to say hello in the meantime, and we'll be asking you to interact via that in a moment. So hopefully you can see my screen and you will see that today's session, we're going to outline what we do a little bit. We'll talk about how to create a safe climate for learning about the news in the classroom, about critical literacy and this approach to looking at news in the classroom, fake or real and critical questioning of information, as well as looking at things like balance and bias and how to interrogate news texts. And then at the end, we'll also talk a little bit about news writing in the classroom as well. So as a way of putting all of this learning about the news together in a responsible way by getting young people to be journalists themselves and write news themselves as well. So that's what we're aiming for today. A little bit about us if you don't know, and thank you, David, for that introduction already. So we're a free news literacy project. You can find all of our resources online and we'll share links about that later as well. As mentioned, we're a partnership between the Guardian Foundation, National Literacy Trust and PSHE Association. PSHE is Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education, and I think in Scotland that's health and wellbeing. And we offer a cross-curricular unit of work. So we've got lesson plans, all the resources that you need for the classroom. We also have resources for families. We do virtual workshops in schools. And as I said, you can download everything from our website. We'll show you how to find that later and send you links as well. All of our team are literacy, PSHE, digital and journalism experts. And what we have in common is that we are passionate about empowering children and their families to engage with and critically navigate the news. So that's what we are and that's what we do. What we advocate for is news literacy. And so what we see news literacy as is that it has these three strands. So first of all, it's about engaging with and understanding the news. So what is it? Where does it come from? How is it created? And also how it impacts on us. How does it make us feel? Then the next strand is critically navigating the news. So that includes things like spotting fake news, but also looking at the difference between fact and opinion, analysing whether there's bias in a news report, questioning where sources have come from, where your source of information is, whether it's trustworthy, knowing what to trust, knowing what's a reliable source. And then the third strand is that reporting real news aspect. So feeling like you can tell a story and that you've got a voice, but also it's about being able to construct text like this, because that's all part of the process of really understanding a text and how it's put together. And when you understand how it's put together, you can understand how to deconstruct it as well. So these are the three strands. And our approach to teaching news literacy is to do it this way. Now, all our resources are aimed at upper primary, and I'm aware that we might have some people here this afternoon who are teaching in the secondary sector. And what I'd say is, although the resources are specifically written for upper primary level, there's, of course, those skills are applicable right the way up through secondary, especially in that transitional phase. And lots of the resources that we're going to talk to you about today can easily be adapted to work with slightly older children as well. So what we try and do is make learning fun and exciting by embedding it in the real world. So putting it in the real world context of the newsroom. We use real news stories all the way through, so high quality examples of text, but getting children to engage with real issues and real news stories. We take a critical literacy approach, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So it's not just about writing about news, it's about really interrogating those new texts as well, and making it purposeful, so giving children a real meaning and purpose to what they're doing. And finally, it's not just about literacy, which is often where you see news being taught. It's a real cross-curricular approach, so across literacy and English, also digital literacy, health and wellbeing, so across all of those different areas. And just to reassure you that what we do works, here are some of the impact results that we've had of the programme. So this was for the most recent full academic year. And that showed that pupils who were taking part had increased interest in the news, they had greater critical engagement with news, they had more confidence when navigating news. 100% of the teachers that we worked with said that people's skills in thinking critically about news stories had increased, and 100% said that they themselves were now more confident in supporting people's news literacy. So hopefully you will also feel more confident by the end of this session as well. And I wanted to highlight that news and news literacy is a really great context for covering lots of the areas of the curriculum that you'd want to be covering in any case. So especially in English and literacy, from core comprehension skills like summarising and fact retrieval, to higher level reading skills like distinguishing between fact and opinion, analysing language, the structure and presentation of texts, inference skills, for example, when it comes to inferring whose points of view are included or not included in a report, and whether there's evidence of bias. And all of this really feeds into this sense of tackling fake news, because fake news isn't always stuff that's completely made up. Sometimes it's about misleading information. And these are all skills that you'd want to be covering in the classroom in any case. And when you talk about writing news, and I really think that's an important part of teaching about news, that covers the entire writing process, from planning to researching to editing, and all of these skills relate to real life jobs in the newsroom. So news writing lends itself really well to being able to demonstrate to pupils the purpose behind every part of the writing process. And as we've mentioned, news and media literacy is a cross-curricular concern, as I'm sure you're all aware. And there's also really strong curriculum links in health and wellbeing, such as the positive and negative effects on physical and emotional health, and digital literacy as well. So all the stuff about managing online information, checking the reliability of sources, identifying bias and author intention. So you can see there's lots of crossover here, and that's why we're a cross-curricular project. And just to show you briefly, this is what our unit of work looks like. So this is our learning journey. And you can see there's 15 lessons there, and there's all the resources that you need to teach these lessons. You can download all of this from our website, and it follows those 3 strands of news literacy that I mentioned earlier. So beginning with understanding what news is, where it comes from, why it's important in society, then going through navigating the news, so those critical questioning skills, looking at fake news, balance and bias, and then finally moving on to reporting news yourself, so putting all those skills into practice by actually reporting a news story. I mentioned this so you can see how we've planned this unit of work. We'll be taking some of the resources and activities from this and showing them to you this afternoon. And it's broadly structured around this shape as well. So the things that we're going to be talking to you about are broadly in this order as well. So that's what our resources look like. I'm going to hand over to Sorsha now to talk about developing a safe climate for learning.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, so it's really important that we develop a safe climate for talking about the news, because the news can impact young people's feelings and actually adults' feelings and well-being in lots of different ways. And obviously it's really important to look after their well-being and safety when we discuss these topics in the classroom. So we're going to look at some of the ways that we can do this. Just to say that all of this advice can be applied to any news story that you or your pupils want to talk about, but it's particularly relevant during major news events. And over the next kind of few slides, I will be referencing the conflict in Ukraine, just as a major news story that's happening at the minute. So the first activity for today's session, I'd like you to think about ways in which news might affect well-being for young people. So this could be things that you've experienced recently following major news stories, maybe people have had kind of reactions to the stories coming out of Ukraine, or just any other ideas more generally about how news impacts the young people that you work with. If you have any thoughts or ideas, I would love you to share them in the chat, please. We can see what everyone's experiences of that are. So how is news affecting young people's well-being and their feelings? Doesn't also have to be negative impacts, could be positive. So you might have positive stories of your pupils interacting with news. Lynn has said anxiety over the situation in Ukraine and what could happen. Yeah, Ukraine comes up a lot, obviously, at the minute in a lot of these sessions. So Simeon has said they can connect news from now and relate them to a topic they've been learning about. Okay, so they might find those kind of connections between different things that they're talking about. So as someone who teaches in a school with a lot of pupils from Eastern Europe, a lot of pupils are anxious about family. That's very understandable. We'll be talking as well about how to keep pupils who might have actually directly experienced the stories that you're talking about, how to keep them safe in the classroom. Worry about spread of war, increased understanding of World War I and World War II. Lots of teachers are saying that children are associating what's happening in Ukraine with what they know about previous world wars. Social media spreading news, yeah, so lots of children getting news from social media. So yeah, lots of people saying kind of just general anxiety, and they're very worried particularly about the war in Ukraine and what's happening over there. It's obviously a huge source of anxiety. So these are some of the ways that we have come up with that news and media can affect young people's well-being. So it can, as everyone's mentioned, it can really increase those feelings of worry and anxiety and fear, especially when there's a major news story happening. And this doesn't just apply to young people, it's really important to say it applies to adults as well. So actually all of the techniques that we're talking about, you can very much apply to yourself and to your own life. So secondly, the news can also make young people feel like the world is a sad place. So they can feel kind of really strong feelings of empathy for people in the story, but it can also lead to feelings of hopelessness and sadness. They might even have an angry response, so kind of those emotional responses, and depending on how that is managed, that could really manifest in different ways for them. It's very understandable that they're feeling very strong emotional responses to stories such as Ukraine. Thirdly, for those who may have personal experience of the story being discussed, reading about it over again can re-traumatize. So the person who mentioned that they have lots of children with Eastern European families, they might feel traumatized by what you're talking about with stories. It can feel as though they're living through these experiences again. If you do have any kind of anyone who's arrived from Ukraine in your classes, that could happen. And those same kind of heightened feelings could be experienced all over again. It can also spike their interest, and they can feel excited and want to take action. It can prompt them to go on a crusade, do something about what they're reading about, which, depending on the story and the source, might be positive or it might be negative. The danger here is that stories that seek to scare or use shock tactics are often the very ones that cause this kind of excitement response, and they make us want to react, and that can lead to harmful behaviours if we're not careful. And finally, and on a slightly more positive note, there are obviously news stories that make us smile and laugh and help brighten our day. The news isn't all negative. It can feel that way, but there are positive stories out there. And we're going to talk about how positive stories form a really important part of looking after our well-being in the session. So Newswise encourages people to become familiar with how news is produced and to interact with real news stories. And throughout today's session, we'll be talking about real stories the whole time. It's really important, therefore, that pupils are supported to handle any news stories they may come across, feel confident to talk about them, and learn how to be sensitive to others when discussing or even producing news themselves, especially if you're discussing them in a classroom setting when there will be other people around. The Newswise PSHE education lessons specifically focus on developing the skills and attributes that enable pupils to manage feelings, emotions, and sensitivities around the news. PSHE education, so practice, should be reflected through all of the Newswise lessons, and it's really important to create and maintain a safe learning environment in the classroom to enable pupils to engage safely. So firstly, the first part of creating a safe environment to talk about the news is setting up agreed ground rules. So agreeing, reinforcing and modelling these, and including concept of confidentiality. So the idea that anything you discuss in the classroom doesn't go any further than that. Other examples of ground rules might include asking people to listen to each other and work together respectfully, not judging other people's opinions or points of view, and to be really careful about the kinds of stories that they're sharing. So not sharing personal stories without permission if they know anything about anyone else in the class. Distancing pupils from stories is really important, especially if the stories are sensitive or controversial. So you might want to create a character or a scenario, and we're going to do an activity around this shortly. So removing the pupils from the situation, asking them how a character might feel or react to the story, not asking how they would react. So it helps pupils to explore situations objectively, whilst having the opportunity to reflect on how it might relate to their own lives without having to kind of personally experience it as well. And being really careful about what news stories we're choosing and what images we're choosing. So avoiding images that might cause shock, fear or guilt or just negative emotions, because they might prevent engagement and they might cause distress or traumatize pupils. You know your classes, you know your pupils, so bear in mind relevant knowledge about people's circumstances, anything that they've been through, and your school's own safeguarding policy, obviously, and how you're going to bring that into the classroom and any stories and images that you might want to avoid based on that. Could I have the next slide, please, Ellie? So as you've all mentioned in the chat, especially with the crisis in Ukraine, children might be afraid that something similar will happen to them or their friends and family. So it's also important to reassure them from the outset that the situation is very rare and it is quite unlikely that something like this will happen to them or people that they know. On that note, though, do be aware of children who might have arrived as refugees or from backgrounds where war has happened. That'd be quite sensitive to say that something isn't going to happen to them. You also might want to wish and kind of to explain and reassure them that the world has been in similar situations in the past and we've come through it. And you can also refer to examples of solidarity shown around the world. So those nice examples of news stories of people coming together to help them. With slightly older children, so for those of you kind of especially in upper primary, but lower secondary as well, you could look at the idea of diplomacy and how different countries around the world are working to try and find a solution. Everyone's got an interest in maintaining peace. And coming on to answering questions, which can be quite difficult, and we get lots of questions about this. So to not answer questions about any news story that children are bringing to you can be counterproductive. You don't want to pretend that nothing's happened. They're obviously aware that something's happening and they're already engaging with it. So it's really important to answer children's questions honestly and in an age-appropriate way in order to allay their possible fears, but also to ensure that children are clear about separating basic facts about an event from speculation, rumour or false information. And we're going to talk about that in more detail later on. So do encourage questions, make sure they're valued, but handle them safely. An effective way of doing this could be to ask people to write down any questions. You could have a question box, which could be anonymous. This means that people don't have to ask questions in front of their peers, but also you don't have to have the answers on the spot. It gives you more time to go away and find the answers. And you can also just say that you don't know the answer and you're going to look it up and come back to them with an answer. In those answers, just make sure that you're always returning to the known facts. So you're always giving them information that you know has happened. Moving on slightly to talking more about facts, always clarify the facts and make sure that you're talking about what you know has happened. So what's happened, what's happening in response, what do we know, how do we know that? Be really clear about the difference between fact, speculation and rumour, and also ensure that you're providing balanced stories, so you're not just providing them information from one side, but just always returning to the facts. So making sure you're using sources like government sources, news sites that you trust and know to be trustworthy, to make sure that you're always talking about what's definitely happened and avoiding speculation, which can cause more uncertainty and more worry. And finally, signpost more places to go for support. So this could be other trusted adults or trustworthy sources of information. You don't have to be the definitive source of all information on these tricky topics. You can signpost other places for children to go to. Sometimes you might not be the expert or the most appropriate source to answer these questions. So signposting these platforms is really helpful, not only for children, but also for you. So you don't kind of feel that pressure of having to answer all the questions. And people should feel confident that they know what to do to help themselves or others, as well as how to report concerns. So let's put this into an example and have a look at what it might look like in practice. So when a breaking news story occurs, it's really natural for children to want to discuss it, as I'm sure you're all aware, and you've all mentioned in the chat when I asked you that question before. So the example we've used here is the war in Ukraine, but of course what I'm going to go through would apply to any news story at all that children may wish to discuss. It doesn't have to be Ukraine. It could be any major news story that's happening. So once the story breaks, children will have already been exposed to the news story and discussions about them already, whether it's at home with their family. For older children on social media, they've got mobile devices already. They'll have been exposed to a lot of information already. And misinformation, particularly about the Ukraine crisis, has been prolific on platforms such as TikTok. And the kind of things going around are really concerning. I'm sure you're all aware of them. There's been content about nuclear weapons being used and all sorts of things, which can just be really unhelpful when we're looking for reliable and trustworthy information. So this structure is really useful for helping you to frame your conversations about these news stories. So you can bring in these 3 questions as a framework, but always take into account the age and developmental stage of your pupils when doing so. So firstly, you would discuss and focus on the known factual information and address any misconceptions the children might have about the issue. So as I've already said, you want to look at news sites that you know to be reliable, government sources, anything that's giving out official and trustworthy information. And we do have a collection of child-friendly news sources on our website as well, so you can go there for child-friendly factual information. You also might want to refer to fact-checking organisations. So Full Fact is the UK's main fact-checking organisation, and they do really brilliant work just taking misconceptions and debunking them. Secondly, you want to focus on the actions we can take to support our well-being when we're reading these stories. And it's really important here that you don't make any assumptions about how your pupils might be feeling, because everybody does respond differently to different stories. So focusing on well-being after you've looked at the facts really, really helps. And then finally, thinking about how we can help to look after others too. So do we share stories with them? Do we discuss stories together? How is a person feeling about a story? Is it better to not share a story with someone if you know that they're feeling really worried about it? Do other people need a break from the news? Do we need a break from the news? There's lots of different things that we can look at as the 3rd step. So going back to what I mentioned about distancing pupils from the story. Sorry, next slide, please, Ellie. I've got my notes over the slide, so I can't see what slide we're on. Moving on to talking about distancing, this is a really useful technique when discussing these news stories in the classroom. It helps children to kind of think about these stories objectively and not re-traumatize or make them experience those negative emotions themselves. So we do have a whole lesson on managing feelings about the news, which you'll be sent afterwards, the link to. But we're going to do this activity first together. So it deals with how characters might feel in response to different news stories, rather than how pupils themselves feel in response to the stories. So the idea here is to draw out different things that might affect how strongly the characters feel about the story. So for example, in this little excerpt that we have, if I were to tell you that the character Maxie really loves gorillas, so say for example they're their favourite animal, or if Maxie lives really close to the zoo, or if Maxie is easily scared, then Maxie might respond differently to the story to someone else who might respond very differently as well. So as a short activity, I would like you to read this little scenario about Maxie watching a news story about a fire at a zoo, and then tell me how you think Maxie might feel after reading this story. So if Maxie's favourite animal is a gorilla, how might they feel? And what other ways might other people respond or react differently? And if you can't read the scenario, I will read it out whilst you're thinking about how Maxie might react to it. So Maxie is watching a news story about a fire at a zoo. The devastating fire was started by vandals breaking into the zoo in the middle of the night. It is not yet clear if they deliberately started the fire. The zookeepers worked all night to try to move the animals to safety, but sadly over 40 animals died. Some of them were rare species. Officials have warned that some of the animals escaped and may still be on the loose. So how would Maxie feel after reading this story? Any ideas in the chat box would be great. Thank you. So Linda has said, traumatized and upset about the poor animals and their suffering, worried about wild animals roaming about nearby. Yeah, so if Maxie lives near the zoo, that's a good one. And worried about the vandals starting fires in other areas when she is asleep. all really good points, and you can see how they're all quite negative emotions. So you might not want your pupils to feel those emotions themselves and asking them to think how they would feel about it, but having them one step removed by asking them to think about how Maxi feels is a really useful technique. Thank you very much. I'm very aware of the time, so I'm going to move on slightly. So considering different strategies to managing feelings really is key, and it's really important to remember that the right action will depend on the person. So the right response to a news story depends completely on who is reading the story. So it's really okay to feel upset or worried about major news stories, and it's definitely not a good idea to ignore those feelings or try to push them away. It's always better to tell someone how you're feeling. But for one person, writing about the story might really help them process it and understand it in their own way. For another, it will make them think about it too much. So a really nice activity is getting young people to consider how different wellbeing approaches work for different people, and that will also enable them to reflect on what will work best for them. So doing something like the activity with Maxi, you might get people to consider what Maxi could do to help them manage their feelings about that news story. One of the key questions here is what would be helpful and what would be less helpful, and then you can identify common behaviours that might not be or might be a healthy way to respond. Also think about how one person's actions can affect another's. So sharing it, for example, how does that impact other people? If a story is really shocking, how does that impact other people that are reading it? And it's just a very useful activity to do in discussion. You can have children share their ideas, and then they can see what other people would do to help them. And you can help guide their responses. And a really important part of looking after our well-being, as I've just mentioned already, is seeking out more positive stories. This gives us a break from the more overwhelming and negative stories. And in the context of the war in Ukraine, it might not be appropriate to divert children's attention with light or fluffy, happy news stories. Instead, you might want to focus on some of the more positive stories of solidarity and generosity that have been coming out of the conflict. So in that way, you're not ignoring that the conflict is happening, but you're not just focusing on the scary and upsetting stories either. And there are lots and lots of brilliant child-friendly news sites where you can find factual news reports and major stories, including on the war in Ukraine. And we do have a range of them, as I've already mentioned, ready collated for you. And some of these are also curating happy news stories specifically for children. So Newsround do really nice roundups of happy and strange news stories. And we also share happy news on our Twitter feed, and we are at Get Newswise, so do check those out. And I'm going to hand you back to Ellie.
Thank you, Saoirse. So that's quite an in-depth introduction into how to bring news into the classroom safely, and we thought it's really important to do that because what our programme is not just about spotting fake news, it's about engaging with news altogether. And what we don't want to happen is that children, because of fake news, disengage with information altogether, and that's what we're going to talk about in this next section, and then we're going to move on to exploring fake news and spotting fake news as well. So critical literacy in the classroom, and a critical literacy approach to looking at news is really important. And what we the way that we approach it is to think about how we want children to be active readers, not passive absorbers of information. So it's about asking and answering critical questions that explore how a text has been constructed. So this could be, is this information reliable? Is it trustworthy? Is it factual? But it also looks at how the writer's chosen to tell the story. So how have people been represented within it? Whose points of view have been included or not included? And asking whether the writer's trying to influence us in some way. And all of this is really important when you're talking about tackling misinformation, because mis and disinformation isn't always just straightforwardly definitely fake or definitely real. There's all of these different layers of meaning and representation in a text. And that's the approach that we try and take. And exploring a text in this way can also be really empowering because it brings your awareness to how text might be impacting on you and how your thinking or your view of the world might be being affected by what you're reading. So if you think about critical literacy in the context of news, as you can see from these examples that I've got on the screen in front of you, one news story can be told in lots of different ways. And we don't always get the full picture or all the facts just from one story. We don't always hear different points of view. And all news organisations have their own values, political opinions that guide their reporting. And so when we come across a news story, a critical literacy approach encourages us to evaluate how that writer has chosen to tell the story, to consider any intention behind it. And if we compare the way stories are represented across different publications, in particular, if you look at headlines, because these can be the most partisan and also sometimes the most misleading parts of stories, you can really notice the different ways that one story can be presented to us, like the example that you've got in front of you. So that's why critical literacy is so important when not just looking for fake stuff, but looking at any news text. And why is it important at the moment? Well, you're all here joining us this afternoon for, I'm sure, lots of reasons, but the spread of mis and disinformation is obviously something that is a concern to lots of people at the moment. So I'm going to put up a few examples here of things that we've seen over the past few years. So things like vaccine mis and disinformation, especially during the pandemic, false claims about vaccines causing deaths, the anti-vax movement, all of that spreading of dangerous information, but also causing greater divides in society and people not knowing what they can and can't trust. As Saoirse already touched on, there's been lots of mis and disinformation about the Ukraine war. From the extreme end of Russian propaganda to just fake information online, things being spread on social media, misleading images, and content that's trying to trigger us, trying to make us worry and get an emotional reaction, because more emotional reactions means more engagement, and then that piece of content has succeeded. And you also get more lighthearted things like this image of a shark swimming down a street after Hurricane Harvey in Texas. This is completely fabricated. It's completely false, photoshopped picture. It was shared tens of thousands of times, though. And if you ask children, well, what if someone was in that situation and they were being told to evacuate their homes because they were in a hurricane, but then they heard there was a shark swimming down the street, how might that person react? Then you can get them to think about, actually, there can be real life consequences, even to bits of fake news that don't seem so consequential. So fake news can make us act in ways that we wouldn't normally do, and sometimes we might put ourselves or others in danger. So being able to critically analyse the news is really important for your safety, for your health, for society, democracy, and for individuals as well. But we know from research from the National Literacy Trust that only 2% of children in the UK have the critical literacy skills that they need to tell if a story is real or fake, and that this causes anxiety. And it also makes them less likely to trust all news as a result of being worried about not knowing what they can trust. In addition, we know that teachers and parents are concerned about children's skills when it comes to misinformation and the effect that it's having on them. So we know this is really important, and this is why we're trying to do something about it. We've also got, these are the most recent stats from Ofcom, their media use and attitude survey with children and adults. These are hot off the press just this week. Because we know that primary age and lower secondary age children are already online. So you can see that for 8 to 11-year-olds, 60% of them already have a smartphone. Obviously, that's far, far higher for older teenagers. So they increasingly have their own devices, also their own social media profiles, and previous research showed that about 45% of children who own a mobile are allowed to take it to bed with them, so they're potentially unsupervised while they're online. So we know that they're already online, they're already using the internet. We want them to make sure they are safe and responsible while they're there, so we want to give them the skills so that they can be truly independent digital citizens, because at the point of upper primary, early secondary school, they're becoming independent in all sorts of ways. So you want them to be able to be responsible, take account of what they're doing, and feel confident that they know what they're doing and can trust the sources that they're relying on when they do go online. An interesting stat that came from those Ofcom surveys was that increasingly teenagers saying that they get their news from social media, but social media is also the least trusted news source. So there is awareness of not being able to trust everything that you read online, but there's also evidence that they're still not that great at deciding whether something is trustworthy or reliable or not. So that's where we come in. So I'm going to move on now to looking at critically questioning online information. So how can we give children these skills? Before we look at some of the activities, just a quick run through of what fake news is and why it exists. So you might hear, and I've already mentioned, misinformation, disinformation. Misinformation generally means things that are out there that are incorrect, but it's an error. People didn't necessarily intend for people to be sharing factually incorrect information. It was a mistake, but it's still out there. It's still misinformation. Disinformation is when it's deliberate, when people are deliberately sharing things that are designed to deceive other people. And it can exist for different reasons. There's a spectrum of it. So you might just get satire accounts that are purely for entertainment, things like the Daily Mash or the Onion. And these generally are really clearly comedy accounts, and they're there just to poke fun at people. They're there as satire. Although sometimes on social media, people don't always see that, and they can be shared as if they're real. Then you get things like clickbait. So this is sites such as World News Daily Report, which is a fake news site. They often share really deliberately provocative and button-pushing articles, and what they want to do is get your engagement. They want people to share, like, respond, react to it, because that's how they make their advertising revenue. Now, lots of these sites might have a disclaimer on them that say this is just for entertainment purposes, or this is just satire. But as I've said, when you share things on social media, people don't always see that. So it's not necessarily clear that these are fake news sites, but they're doing it deliberately to get those clicks and get that reaction. And then at the extreme end, you have deliberate propaganda. Sites or organizations that are sharing deliberately twisted stories that might stem from a factual piece of information, but then they're presenting it in a really misleading way, and they've got a real agenda behind them. They want you to believe or act in a certain way as a result. And increasingly, news is spread via closed social networks like WhatsApp, for example, and people don't always have access to the original source or the story in the context that it was originally shared. So the question that we always want children to ask is, what's the purpose of this report? What is it trying to make me do or think or believe? And where has it come from? And we'll come on to questioning the source in a moment. But I know we haven't got all that much time left. We've got so much more we want to get through, but we've got a fake or real quiz for you this afternoon. So one of the activities that we're going to do with you is this fake or real quiz. So first up, we've got this story, and I'd like to get your gut reaction, please. Do you think this is a real or a fake story? And can you just share what you think in the chat, as you have previously? The headline is "Woman Arrested for Training Squirrels to Attack Her Ex." Do you think this is real or fake? And just give us your gut reaction. So we've got a mixture at the moment. I think it's mainly fake, but we've got quite a few reels in there as well. Now, essentially, I haven't given you enough information to make an informed decision. But of course, this is how we see information online a lot of the time. You just get a headline and a picture, and you don't necessarily see where it's from or read the whole article. And so we're all the time making these gut reactions about whether something's believable or not. But actually, it's really hard to tell whether something is real or not just by looking at that picture and headline. So what we want to encourage children to do is look in a bit more detail at where the stories come from and whether it's reliable. So some of the tools for evaluating the information in more depth are things like our news navigator. So our Newswise code is to always stop, question, check, and decide. So always stop and think about it, ask some questions, and do some checks before you immediately react to something. So instead of immediately sharing with it someone with the story or liking it, which might help to promote it, you want to question, where has it come from? Do I trust that person or that organisation? Have I heard of them before? And then check whether it's been shared by other people, whether other reliable sources are also sharing the story, and what are they saying about it. So if we start by questioning that source, like I said, who has reported it? Have you heard of them before? Is it somewhere that you trust? Does the web page or the URL look normal? Looking at that source, have they used a formal writing style? Have they got correct spelling and punctuation? Have they got photos that show the event with a caption and a credit? All of those questions are things that you can ask to interrogate the source. With younger children, you might want to introduce them to a few trustworthy sources. So you might need to bring in some knowledge of that, including things like fact-checking sites as well. Here's a few examples. It is not a definitive list by any means, and you might want to bring in local news stories, sources or school-based sources as well. But thinking about that, thinking about the source, let's revisit that woman who was arrested for training squirrels to attack her ex. Here it is in the context of the website where it was shared. So this is the source of the story. So if we look at this now, can you tell us what you think? Do you think this is real or fake? And this time I'd like you to tell me why. What are your reasons for thinking this is a real or a fake story? So if you look at some of the different features on the page, for example, does it look like a trustworthy site? Have you heard of them before? Has it got a picture? Does the picture have a caption? Does it show what was actually happening? Is there a date for the story? And use any of this to tell you whether you think it's real or fake. So yeah, it looks like a clickbaity site. We've got someone saying it's fake, looks clickbaity. Yeah, it's got a sort of strange name. 1029thebuzz.com, haven't heard of them before. And yeah, if you look at some of the other things that are on there, you've got things like free beer and hot wings and local buzz and buzz sessions. It doesn't sound all that trustworthy. Yeah, it sounds like a gossip site maybe. And there's no actual reporting of an event. So if you read the story itself, you can't actually see what has happened. Lots of ads in the sidebar. So if it's really ad driven, that could be a sign as well. The picture looking photoshopped. Yeah, it's a really strange picture. And yeah, maybe that wants to sway us. It makes us think, oh, this is an amusing story. So an arresting picture. But that picture, if I was reading this story about trained squirrels, I want to see some of those trained squirrels in the photo, please. Where's our evidence that it's actually happened? And this photo, there's no caption, there's no credit for where it's come from. It could be just a picture taken from anywhere. And so actually, yes, of course, you're completely right. This is a fake story for all of the reasons that you've just gone through. Okay, so very good at interrogating a source. Let's move on to the next slide. So this one is another story. It's hand over the trash, raccoons break into California bank. So what do you think about this one? We've given you the source this time. Do you think this is a real or a fake story? And can you tell us why? Again, in the chat. So looking at all those things again, the context of the story, what the source looks like, whether it looks reliable to you, any reasons why you would or would not trust this story. Okay, so this time we've got someone thinks it's real. So you've got images of what's happening. So yeah, this time you do have the raccoons. Yeah, I've got a picture of the raccoons this time. It's a reliable source that you've heard of before. It's not on the 1st of April, so you know it's not an April Fool's joke. So you do have the date, and the date's a good indicator actually, because often with fake news sites they won't put the date on there because it means that they can keep it up there and keep sharing it over and over again, and it won't show its age. We've got known source, photo credited. We can see the raccoons. There's evidence of it. We've got the writer's name. You've got the photo, the name of the author, and it's just a nice feel-good story. Okay, perfect. Very good, everybody. Yes, this is a real story. So the other thing that you can do once you've finished interrogating the source, obviously the really quick thing that you can do is to check whether anybody else is reporting on the story. So that's the other thing that we encourage children to do, is to think about, okay, if you're not sure about it, can you see if anybody else is sharing it who you have heard of before? And of course, someone might be sharing it, but they're saying this is not a true story, this is a fake story. So you might want to introduce some vocabulary to look for as well. So things like it's saying this is fake, or there's been a fact check, or no, this didn't happen. That is sometimes something that you see on news searches as well. So that's the next thing to do. So I've got another story for you here. Again, I'd like to get your gut reaction on this one. Do you think this is a fake or real story? So this one is California theme parks banning screaming on roller coasters. Do you think this one's real or fake? I think it's a slightly harder one, this one. So gut reaction first of all, and then we're going to think about checking the coverage. So first vote is in for fake, couple of fakes. How could you police it? Someone's saying they hope it's fake. So first of all, lots of people saying, yeah, I think this is a fake story. Now we've got someone saying, oh, actually, maybe it's true. It was the kind of mad things that came out during the COVID pandemic. The supporting information, it seems like a legitimate website. So it's unclear. This one I think is a little bit more tricky. So something that you can do to check it is to do a search on a search engine. So this time we've used Google News, and one of the things that you can do is actually do a news search. So instead of just going to all, if you click on the news tab, you will just get the news stories about the subject that you've searched for. So here we've done a search. We've put in our keywords, California theme park ban screaming, and the first things that come up are fact checks that say, no, this did not happen. So here we've got some clear evidence that although this was being reported quite widely, actually, it wasn't true, it didn't happen. This is actually a bit of a misleading story. So that headline is really misleading, saying that it had been banned. There was guidance suggesting that you should try and restrict people from shouting and screaming too much, but you're absolutely right. How would you possibly police it? It definitely wasn't banned in theme parks. And if you clicked on either of these links, you'd be able to find out lots more information about how they debunked the story as well. So this was actually a fake story. Okay, have we got time to do this? I think, well, let's try and do it really quickly. We've got another story for you here. Was there an invisible sculpture that sold for more than £12,000? Now, you might get some information from the source here, but I'd also like you, if you are able to try and check the coverage. So if you've got a phone available, or you're able to check in some other way, could you try doing a search for this story and see if it's shared by anybody else? And I'll just give you a few moments to do that. I know we don't have all that much time left, so we'll move on quite quickly. And I think I'm going to move on just because I know it will take you a little bit of time to do that search. But hopefully if you're managing to do it, or you get to do it later, you will see something like this. So hopefully you'll see lots of different organizations who are sharing the same story. So we've got the New York Post, we've got a children's news website called Dogo News is sharing it. We've got Boston 25 News, we've got The Independent. We've got someone in the chat saying, yep, they've found it. And they've given us a quote from it. They read about it from a trustworthy news source. So this, although it sounds unlikely, it is a true story. And you've got all of these different organizations that are sharing it. And you can see they're all shared around about the same time. They're all saying exactly the same thing, that this sculpture really did sell for £12,000 or $18,000. So checking whether other people have shared it is another really good way of checking whether something is a legitimate story. So this one actually was a real story. Now, doing this safely in the classroom is something that we get asked about a lot, and you'll see that we've used lots of screen grabs in this, and we use an app called Cloud QR. to create QR codes so that children can scan the QR codes and it appears on a tablet or a device in a way that you might normally see it online. But with this app, and I'm sure there are lots of different ones that you can find, it allows you to link to a screen grab, not just a website. And you can also look at it completely offline. So children can be in a completely safe offline space, but experiencing it as you might in real life. So if you scan either of those QR codes that you can see on the screen, you'll see that. And what that also allows you to do is you can highlight particular things that you want children to be able to notice, maybe looking at the URL or looking at particular things that you want to draw their attention to. So a safe way of doing this, because obviously what you don't want to do, especially in primary, is just to say, okay, go and do a Google News search on this not trustworthy story, because you don't know what they might find. So being able to keep it contained in that way is something that we do all the time in our workshops. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Saoirse now to talk about pictures on the internet.
Thanks, Ellie. So one thing that we find in our work with schools and children is that if there's a picture with a news story, children and also adults, it's not just children, are way more likely to believe that a story is real, because a picture gives a story credibility. With the raccoon example, people in the chat actually were saying that there's a picture of the raccoons, therefore it must be true. That it does make the story more believable, but that picture of raccoons could technically be from anywhere. So there's an example on your screen here of, this was a picture of Hyde Park here in London, and it was going viral on Twitter and social media, with people claiming that this was lots of rubbish left over after an Extinction Rebellion protest, which was completely untrue. The parks, actually, their official account came out and said, this is a picture of rubbish in Hyde Park, but it's just from an unrelated event. It's nothing to do with Extinction Rebellion. Obviously, people have a reason to be putting out negative stories about Extinction Rebellion, but it's a completely unrelated image. So that's an example of how miscaptioning can make a picture really, really misleading. And you can do this in a fun and safe way with your pupils. So you can give them a fun image like the one of the koala in the boots that you can also see on your screen. And you can challenge pupils to come up with a caption for it that makes it a misleading photo. So I'd like you to, we've got a couple of minutes to do this, come up with a caption for this photo that completely changes the meaning of the photo. So the real caption would be a picture of a koala in a boot. Your misleading caption could be something more amusing, like man zapped and turned into koala, or man zapped by aliens and turned into koala. That is completely changing the image, the meaning of that image. So if anyone has any ideas of any fun captions that you could do for this picture, please do put them in the chat. We would love to see them. It's a bit of a challenge, actually, after a long day of teaching, a creative challenge. But if you do have any ideas, do post them in the chat. So you can do this with any amusing picture that you can find, but there is kind of a serious side to it. So when you're talking about it with pupils, you do want them to think about, when would it be a bad idea, or why is it irresponsible or dangerous to put a misleading caption on a picture? We have an idea here: cases of koala kleptomania on the rise. I like the alliteration as well. Brilliant headline device, caption device. Koala survives bushfire hiding in boot. Great. Hiker saved koala in a lovely way. Australians encouraged to check their boots for sleeping koalas. Next on the woke agenda, koala shoes. Just really exciting that the culture was there. Thanks, Zach. So you can see how that's a really nice activity that you can do with them to kind of show this idea of miscaptioning and how it can make a picture misleading. So moving on to other ways that pictures can be manipulated. Forced perspective is another really common way that pictures can be misleading. So you can see here an example of a giant rat that was found not far from where Ellie and I both live, actually. It's not a giant rat at all. It's a normal sized rat held on the end of a stick, really, really close to the camera to make it look like it's huge. This obviously isn't particularly malicious. It's quite a funny example, and it's not always really extreme or deliberately faked examples that you might see online. You might have seen at the beginning of the pandemic the pictures of all the crowded parks and beaches. They were shot using really long lenses to make it look like everyone was really crowded together, and it was all angles and perspective. So again, just spinning narratives that just weren't really, really happening at all. And this is another activity that you can do with your pupils. You can see there an example of a forced perspective picture that a child made at one of our events. But it's really important to, along with the forced perspective picture, show how that picture was made. So you would have a picture of the child sitting separately to the chair, so that you're showing how it's done and you're demonstrating how pictures can be misleading. And another way pictures can be manipulated is through Photoshop. Most children have heard of Photoshop, and when we set these challenges to children and ask them to identify how a picture might be misleading, their most common response is Photoshop, but only once they're told that the picture isn't real. So once you tell them that, they then immediately go to Photoshop. You can do a reverse image search in most search engines. So you can see on your screen here that we've done it in Google. So you just right click on an image and then search Google for the image, and you'll see more information about that picture and where it originally appeared. So we can see for this one with the cyclist and the bear, it originally came from a comedy website, and if you were to scroll further down in that Google search, you could see that it was photoshopped. A note as well, similarly with doing it with the QR codes, this isn't an activity for children to do by themselves. If they're reverse searching images, they could find anything, so just make sure they are supervised, or that you've done it before them so you know what they're going to find. If we move on to viral posts, misleading pictures are spread really, really easily and quickly on social media, like we saw with the Extinction Rebellion picture, with no evidence at all to tell people where the image came from. It's really difficult to find the source of a lot of images that circulate on social media, and that is why they go viral. And unfortunately, the more often people see a piece of information, the more likely they are to believe it's real. So this is a really nice example of how false information spreads really easily via social media. So this is a picture of a baby platypus, which was shared over 30,000 times. So if we look at the source, the account does appear to be a genuine knitting account. So they share lots and lots of things like knitting and crafting, but not necessarily a lot about platypuses. What makes them an expert on platypuses? Why would they share this picture? So they are a legit account, they are real, they do get likes on their posts and they do post content, but this seems a bit strange. So we should stop and question whether this really does look like a baby animal. And if you do a reverse image search, you see that the first few articles seem to be saying it's not real. And if you click the first one, you see an article from Science Alert saying it's actually made of plastic. And the article goes on to show the original source of the image and who took it. So it was taken by the artist who made it. So it was made by an artist who makes plastic models. If you've never heard of Science Alert before, you can also check them out on the website and find out that they are a real news website. And this is when you bring in those checking the coverage skills that we've just practiced in that fake or real headlines quiz. So if it's a source you've never heard of, you can still do all the same checks and then decide whether you think it's trustworthy or not. They are a real news organisation. They have transparent editorial values and a fact-checking system, and they do also encourage people to contact them if they spot any mistakes. So the knitting account does appear to have shared this image genuinely believing that it was a real photo of an actual baby platypus, and many of the people who shared, liked and commented agreed, but it's actually a sculpture by a fantasy artist. So this is a fairly benign example of misinformation. There was no malice, no one was deliberately trying to deceive anyone, but it doesn't stop it being something completely fake and incorrect that's floating around on the internet. If the original poster had taken the time to stop, question and check before sharing, it wouldn't have misled so many people. So that's images, and we've looked at how fake news stories and images can be deliberately created and shared, but a lot of what we see around news stories, especially on social media, is rumour, speculation and opinion, and it can be really, really difficult to tell what is trustworthy information in this context, especially when reputable news sources or people that you trust are sharing information that is essentially just speculation or rumour. It's not necessarily fact. So it's really, really important to know the difference between what is a fact and what is not. So you have 4 statements on your screen, and I would like to see if you can identify which of these is a fact, which is a rumour, which is speculation, and which is opinion. And I'd like you to add your answers to the chat box with a reason why for each one. So they are numbered. So we have number 1 is, I reckon the gorilla escaped because he was angry. Oh, sorry, just to say, this is an activity about a story, a gorilla escaping from London Zoo, which was a real story. And you can find this activity in our lesson on fake news. So which of these statements is a rumour, fact, speculation, or opinion? So number 1 is, I reckon the gorilla escaped because he was angry at all the stupid visitors banging on the glass all day. Number 2 is, London Zoo has confirmed that at 5:30 p.m, Kumbuka the gorilla was safely returned to his den after drinking 5 litres of squash found in the staff area. Number 3 is, apparently a huge silverback gorilla at London Zoo smashed through his den and escaped. Gorilla on the rampage. Number 4 is, I feel sorry for the gorilla. If I was in a glass cage with people staring at me all day, I would want to escape too. So which is which, and can you tell me why? So we have 1 is speculation, 2 is fact, 3 rumour, 4 an opinion. Got 1 and 4 as opinion. It can be quite tricky. There is 1 of each though. There is 1 fact, 1 opinion, 1 rumour, and 1 speculation in this. It also might be useful if you're doing this with pupils to bring in a word bank, so you could give them the key vocabulary for this in a language that shows what is opinion, fact, rumour, speculation. I think everyone's going for the same. So we have 1 is speculation, 2 is fact, 3 is rumour, and 4 as opinion. And Ellie, if you could bring up the answers. Well done, you got them all right. So we have the clue for speculation is that I reckon. So I reckon that is what tells us that it's speculation. For rumour, we have apparently, so something that you've heard that you're passing on is a rumour. Really nice way to contextualise rumours for children is something that they've heard in the playground or in the corridor at school that they're passing on. Number 4 is opinion. So you have I feel, so anything that's I feel or I think is our opinion there. And then number 2 is the fact. We have London Zoo has confirmed. And something else that you might want to bring in here is the news context. So getting children to think about the importance of facts and the potential consequences of spreading rumours, and if that's happening during an ongoing news story. You can also start to look at the sources as well of the content that you're using, so if the tweets, so for example the fact is coming from London Zoo's official account, is that more likely to be sharing reliable information than a random person who's just tweeting their thoughts about this story? So you can start bringing that in depending on the age of your pupils. And back to Ellie briefly.
Thank you, Saoirse. So yeah, we're just going to move slightly on to looking at balance and bias. So we started introducing, actually it's not just about real or fake, it can be about whether something's opinion or fact, and also the other things that we explore with pupils is looking at a text, even if it is from a reliable source, even if it is somewhere that you trust, you can still be looking for, is it telling me the full story? Am I getting all of the different sides of the story here? So we've got a few activities on analysing how news stories might not be giving us the full picture, or maybe they're misleading in some way. So this activity that I've got in front of us here, this comes from our lesson on balanced news reporting. And that's all about getting pupils to think about the importance of including multiple and maybe contrasting viewpoints. And the lessons use the real news story of the Extinction Rebellion climate change protests. And what we do is we've got 2 very different examples of reporting, showing 2 really different sides of the story. So I've got 1 extract here from one of the reports, and I'd like you to have a go at reflecting on some of the questions that we've got in the blue box there. So whose points of view can you hear, but whose are not included? And if there are people who are not included, what might they think about this report? So I'll read it out for you, but have a think about who's being represented here, but who is actually being excluded from this story. And if you can give us some examples of that in the chat, that would be great. So what we've got in front of us is thousands of climate change activists have been protesting in London since Monday, blocking famous landmarks to try and force the government to take action against climate change. Nathan, a protester, said, "We need to do something drastic to have action." Laura, a retired teacher who travelled from Somerset to join the protest, said, "I'm so worried about what's happening to the planet. It's terrifying and the government have done nothing despite all the warnings, so we have to act now." So we've got some representation in there, but is it giving us everybody? Is it giving us the full picture? So here we've got only protesters included. those impacted by the protests are not included. Absolutely, thank you. Protesters only are being represented in this. So who are some of the people that aren't being represented? This is something that you could ask children to try and identify. Who else should be being asked questions of? So people who are being inconvenienced, just looking at the chat here. So is that commuters who are trying to get across London, delivery drivers, the government maybe, because they're trying to force the government to change, so maybe we should have asked the government about it. Could be tourists who are in London who just wanted to see the sights, but they've been blocking the famous landmarks. They haven't been asked about it. Taxi drivers who are just trying to do their job and they can't get across London, and so they're not going to make any money that day. They haven't been asked about it. So getting children to think about who's been represented and who hasn't been, and why that's important, is the purpose of this activity. And how it works in the wider activity is that one of the examples is this one that you can see on the screen, and the other one is another example of the report that just has the anti-protest viewpoints. And if you get half the class to look at one report and half the class to look at the other, they can then compare what they thought, and they can get ideas from each other about who should be represented, and how you might be able to tell the full story there. Another activity that we have which looks at bias is about this story of a pigeon who was fed chips by a teenager, and the teenager for doing this got a fine for littering. And so this story has been presented in a specific way to make us feel specific things about different characters in the story. Now, I should say that this is a genuine story, like the Extinction Rebellion one, real things that really happened. We have edited and adapted this story, firstly to make it accessible for children, but also to emphasize the bias. But I will tell you that some of the reporting on this was pretty biased in the way that it represented different people in the story. So again, I'd like you to have a look at this and then answer these questions. Who do you want to defend in this story, and who would you like to criticise, and why? What are the clues in the language? What's the writer trying to make you feel by the vocabulary that they're using to describe the different people? So just while you have a read, I will read it out for you as well, in case anyone can't see it on their screen. So the story is, Lauren Page Smith, 19, was treating herself to a McDonald's for lunch when she kindly offered one of her chips to a hungry bird. She was immediately approached by a rude council worker who thoughtlessly issued her with a £25 fine for littering. Animal lover Lauren told the official that she hadn't been littering. She explained that the pigeon had eaten the whole chip and so there was no litter left on the ground. However, the harsh council worker still gave her the fine. So clearly we're being guided to thinking particular things about different people in the story. So here we've got in chat, thank you for sharing, Lauren's the person to be defended. She was just treating herself. She was being kindly. She's an animal lover. Don't we all love Lauren? It wants you to feel sympathy for Laura. She was, the birds were hungry, so she was just, being kind to the hungry birds. And then the council worker is described as rude, harsh. They acted thoughtlessly. So it's quite biased towards Lauren and against the council worker. And when you get children to isolate the vocabulary in that way, it makes it really clear that we're being guided to think a certain way. And a way that you could extend this further is to get children to think about, well, okay, what might be the reasons why they didn't want people throwing chips on the ground? What could have been the motivations of the council worker for saying, actually, you shouldn't be doing this here? And to get them to think about what the full picture might be. And other ways of extending some of these activities about looking at balance and bias is to think about how else could the news stories have been told. So one of the things that we have in our activities is getting children to rewrite a story so that it's not biased anymore, so they've got balanced rather than unbalanced news reports. You might also do hot seating and get children to be in character as certain people in those stories, or have a press conference where they have to give their opinion about it. So you're getting them to explore and infer those different opinions and emotions. Word banks, like I already suggested, and like I showed you right at the beginning of the session, looking at different headlines across different publications about the same story is a really good way of highlighting this as well. So we've just got about 15 minutes left, and although the focus of today's session was on tackling fake news and misinformation, we wanted to include a little bit on the writing news process, because this is a really great way of getting children to really engage with what news is, why it's important, and why it's important to always tell the facts. So I'm going to hand back to Saoirse now, and we'll just whiz through these last few slides.
Thanks, Ellie. Yep, so I'm going to talk about exactly what I just said, practically teaching Newswise in the classroom and getting great writing outcomes. So a really, really great and exciting thing to do is to make the experience really immersive. So you want to create a newsroom in your classroom, get children really excited about what you're doing. And we have loads and loads of resources and ideas to help you create that immersive newsroom experience in your classroom, from fun props to display and ideas and resources to download. You can find everything on our website, and you will be sent the link to the specific page with all these ideas. We've used all of our expertise of the newsroom to help you create a really authentic atmosphere in the classroom and make it very fun and exciting. And moving on to the kinds of stories that we include, hopefully you've got the impression now that we really, really care about children using real news stories all the time. So we always use real news stories, and they are always age appropriate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always fluffy or animal or sport related. You can talk about serious and impactful stories with your pupils. They don't always have to be fun or unchallenging. In fact, the lesson that we actually get the most positive feedback about is one that deals with the Windrush scandal. It really engages children's sense of social justice and like unfairness, because it's so there's so much injustice going on in that story. Other topics that really engage children are homelessness or housing. So you can see examples here on the screen. Environmental issues, as I'm sure you're aware, really, really engage them. They're really interested and passionate about them. Anything about young people being treated unfairly really engages their sense of empathy and sympathy. People with disabilities, refugees, all of that kind of thing. So don't be afraid to shy away from these bigger topics that are happening. You'll find that you get better results from your children when you are talking about these topics with them, rather than just light-hearted stories. And moving on to look at writing outcomes themselves, and also looking a little bit at what effective news writing looks like. This is our news writing toolkit, which we've broken down into language, structural and layout features, and we've broken those down within them as well. So these are kind of the three components of putting together a news report, and we're going to see how they apply to a real news report now. So this is an example of a real news report from the Guardian website about a shark that was abducted from an aquarium in Texas in a pram. It's a real story. It's a great one to use in the classroom because it seems completely unbelievable, but it is entirely true. So let's start with how a news report is put together. So we always start with a 5W introduction. So the who, the what, the when, where, and why. And the most important thing to notice here is that the introduction always begins with the most interesting or important detail. So often the who or the what of the story, but never the date. So a really easy way to think about this is if you were to bump into somebody that you've seen, your friend, and you have something important to tell them, the first, you say, I've got something to tell you, the first question is going to be, oh, what happened? It's almost never, when did it happen? Because that's not the most interesting thing. In terms of structure, you'll also notice that news reports use really short paragraphs, and a really simple way to understand this is that you begin a new paragraph whenever a new fact or a quote or idea is given. It can mean that your news report ends up being lots of kind of individual sentences and aren't necessarily built into paragraphs. That's absolutely fine. That is just how news reports are written. If you bring up the inverted pyramid, you can see this is a structure that all journalists use all the time when they are putting together their reports. So the most important information comes at the top, that's what you spend the most time on, and then you get less and less important as you move through. All that key information needs to be given straight away. You have to kind of write it as though you're assuming that someone might not get to the end of your report, so you don't put anything important towards the end. In terms of language, the key to news writing is formal and concise language written in the third person. So really, really different to what we see in narrative writing, where you might be encouraging pupils to use lots of nice descriptive words and lengthy sentences and paragraphs. We don't want any of that in news writing, because we want to get to the point as quickly and simply as possible, and you don't want lots of extra words getting in the way of what you're trying to tell people. So a really key sub-editing skill in news writing is getting rid of unnecessary or redundant words, and that is something that one of our lessons does get pupils to do. It can be really tricky for children to get their heads around this style of writing, because they're not used to it, and it's very different to what we're normally asking them to do. You might see them sign off in the style of a newsreader, so saying something like "thank you for reading, see you next time," because they might be used to watching TV, news on the TV, sorry. So it's really important to immerse them all the time in lots and lots of different examples of news writing and different news types, so that they get used to it. We've marked up the differences here between like upper and lower Key Stage 2, or more able and less able students. This might apply to lower secondary school as well. So you've got relative clauses and reported and direct speech there as well, as a slightly more advanced skills. And then finally, moving on to layout features. So these are the fun bits. So this is putting in your headline, your stand first, and the stand first gives a little bit extra information underneath the headline. You've got a picture and a caption. A byline is who the story is about, and your date. These are the nice, easy bits to do. Not that writing a headline is easy, but if you were to put any text type into this format, it would look like a news report, but without the language and the structural features being there, it won't read like a news report. So they come first, they're the most important bit. When real news articles are put together, that is the order that they do them in. They write them, they get the words down, and then they put all the, it's called page furniture, all the page furniture in. So that is the process that the lessons follow as well, and the process that you should follow if you're doing news writing with pupils. So let's have a look at some opening paragraphs, and I would like you to read them, and based on what I've just told you about how to write an effective opening paragraph with the 5 W's, I'd like to tell me which of these ones you think works best and why. So there's just 3 short paragraphs. I will read them in case anyone can't see them, and in the chat you can just tell me which one you think is best. So number 1 is: a factory that makes plastic had a fire today, and firefighters arrived early this morning to try to put it out. When they got there, they were putting out the fire for several hours, but the blaze continued. Later in the day, they saw a firenado. Number 2 is: on Tuesday, 7th of August, firefighters who were putting out a blaze at a plastics factory in Derbyshire spotted a firenado. And number 3 is: a firenado has been spotted by firefighters tackling a plastics blaze in Derbyshire today. We're getting some answers in. So everyone so far has gone for 3. Linda's pointed out that the who and the what come before the when. Great. Great, so everyone's going for 3, so well done. That is definitely the most effective opening paragraph. We get all the 5 W's in a nice short paragraph. We have all the key information. So if I wanted to, I could just read that paragraph and I would have a general understanding of the story and I'd know what happened. Also, in the story, a firenado is definitely the most exciting and interesting bit. And in paragraph 1, they've put it right at the end. It's literally the last word, and it's a 3-sentence opening paragraph, which is just way too long and way too lengthy. I got bored reading it out. And number 2 again starts with the date. It's not something that happens in news reports. When a news story happens is usually implicit, because it usually happens just before it's reported or very, very recently to it being reported. So you don't need the date in such a prominent position. It's not the most interesting part of a story. So well done, everyone identified the correct one. Gonna very, very quickly look at this real news report written by a pupil. I'm not going to ask you to read the written news report on the side. We've picked out an excerpt for you to look at. And if you can, just have a very quick read of these 2 paragraphs that we've picked out, and also look at the layout features in the written one as well. And tell me what you think the student did well and what they could improve. For context, this pupil's in year 5, so that might help you put it into context. What do they do well? What could be improved? If you have a quick read of it, and again, I will read it out for anyone who can't see it. So it all began on a Tuesday afternoon. Oh yeah, sorry, year 5 is P6. Okay. It all began on Tuesday afternoon at 5:30 p.m. behind the equipment shed. On the field lay a small, shiny UFO. To their disbelief, the teachers listened to a confusing, terrifying voicemail. Miss Austin, Year 5 teacher, said that she felt very nervous and worried after discovering the crash. Miss Taylor, Year 6 teacher, added, "I couldn't believe what I saw. I'm still in shock." So anything that this pupil has done well, anything that could be improved? Any thoughts? Good use of direct quote. Yep, thank you, Linda. Yeah, they do the direct and the reported speech really, really well. So we have an example of both. And it's done very naturally, very skillfully. It is very good use of them. Great. So kind of the main issue with this report is, well, not the main issue, but so we've got some unnecessary words, thanks Lynn. So they use a lot of adjectives, so small, shiny UFO, it begins in a very kind of narrative sense. So it all began on Tuesday afternoon. So yeah, the time and date can be offered at a different part of the story. If a UFO lands on the playground, the most exciting thing isn't that it happened on Tuesday afternoon, but it is building suspense. It's a really lovely piece of narrative writing. It's not an effective piece of news writing. Because it is building that suspense when all we want to do with news writing is get straight to the facts. So you could get rid of a lot of those adjectives. But that second paragraph is really lovely, where they've used the relative clauses and the reported and direct speech. We have had a go at remodeling this paragraph. It's still not great, but it's a little bit better, gets to the point a bit sooner. So we remodeled it as a UFO landed in a school playground on Tuesday afternoon. Teachers discovered that the alien landing was accompanied by a message left on the school voicemail. So it just needs a little bit of improvement, but it's a good start. But the main issue with this story is that it's about a UFO landing on the playground. It's a completely fictitious, fake story. So the teachers went to loads of effort. They staged a UFO landing in the playground, obviously really inspired the children and they were really excited by it. But we want children to write about real news stories. We spend a whole set of lessons teaching them about how to spot fake news and how to avoid it and the importance of reporting facts. And then that culminates in reporting something that hasn't happened. So children should always write real news stories about real things that are happening around them. And you get way better outcomes. So you have pupils writing for a real audience with a real purpose. They'll be much more motivated and their writing will seem much more authentic when they're writing about something that's really happened. So we move on to the next slide. So aside from getting better outcomes, it's really empowering for them. You're giving them a voice. They have to find stories that are happening around them. You could do something like a school-led newspaper or inviting families to come in. So it's really engaging that local community and having children engage with and understand things that are happening around them and look at them from different points of view and different perspectives. No one's asking 9 or 10-year-olds what it's like to be 9 or 10 at the minute. So this is an opportunity to give them that voice and let them express themselves. Some examples, which I won't go into too much detail, of topics that pupils have written about if you are wanting to do this in your own classroom. So you could do something really close to school, something that's happening directly in children's local community, or you could do a much bigger global story, but find an angle on it that makes it relevant to you and your local area. So for example, a school wrote about air pollution, which is obviously a huge global issue, but they wrote about how it impacts them. They live on they go to school, on one of the most polluted roads in London. So that was their local angle on it. So you can see how they did that. And it can be quite scary to kind of say to pupils, like, go off and find a story to report and research it. You don't know what they're going to come back with. Sorry, Ellie, I'm taking your slide. Do you want to do it? But remember that you are always in role as chief, again carried away, you're always in role as chief editor, so you can keep them safe. You can veto stories that you don't think are appropriate. You can ask them to write down suggestions for stories, or you could offer them a range of stories that you've kind of already vetted and know are safe. And it goes back to creating that safe environment. You know what experiences children in your class have had and what might and might not be appropriate for them to research and write about. And then finally, just moving on to creating a real audience. You can set up a school newspaper. That's a really nice thing to do. Some schools just give over one of the editions of their school newsletter to some pupils and have them do it that way. You can upload reports to the school website. You can perform a news bulletin in assembly. You can invite parents in to watch that. You can do a fake or real quiz with them. All this kind of exciting thing you can do. Invite a real journalist in to give feedback. You can have them read their reports. There's lots and lots of different things that you can do to create that real audience, which then really, really motivates pupils to produce very authentic and trustworthy news reports. And then finally, we just have some lovely things that teachers have said about doing Newswise to inspire you to do it yourselves if you would like to. Ellie, seeing as I bulldozed it over all of your slides there, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Thanks, Saoirse. So just to say thank you all for joining us, and thanks so much for all your interaction this afternoon. I hope that it's given you some things to think about and things that you can take straight into the classroom.
Thanks, Ellie and Saoirse.